Welcome back to This is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to talk about Commander, Tough Rules, and Cool Interactions, episode 85. Today's episode is going to take a look at one of the newly spoiled legendary creatures from the Lord of the Rings set, as well as a bit of a dive into phase. And by that, I don't mean things like main phase and combat phase, but the status of something being phased in or phased out. Also, be sure to stick around for the bonus question about phase at the end of the video. I have touched on phasing just a bit back in the Tough Rules and Cool Interactions episode 39 when I did the All Things Teferi's Protection episode, but now I'm going to cover it a bit more in depth in this episode as we cover this new creature. And speaking of, King of the Oathbreakers is a 3/3 legendary spirit noble for 2 white-black that flies and has 2 triggered abilities. The first one says, whenever King of the Oathbreakers or another spirit you control becomes the target of a spell, it phases out. And then his second triggered ability says, whenever King of the Oathbreakers or another spirit you control phases in, create a tapped 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So first impressions is that this dude is pretty dang powerful, but then as I read the king again, I noticed a massive flaw with him that I feel a whole lot of players will not catch and end up playing this commander improperly. So before I start to list a whole bunch of cards in this episode, I do want to preface that I won't be reading a lot of them, as their effects are not too important in the context of interacting with this commander, just the fact that they target, and I'll still show them on screen for you to pause and read them if you do want to. You can use a bunch of old cards from Magic's history like Heaven's Gate, Touch of Darkness, and Scapegoat that are singular spells that cost only 1 mana to cast yet let you target all of your creatures, which triggers the king's first triggered ability for each of those targeted creatures. And then we can also even use some more modern cards like Semester's End and Eerie Interlude, which also let you target all of your creatures. But you do want to avoid using spells like Ghost Away, as it may seem similar to something like Eerie Interlude and Semester's End, has a similar effect to it, but because it doesn't actually use the word target, it does not actually trigger the king's ability. So why would you want to use cards like these to target your spirit tokens? Exiling them would mean that they cease to exist, right? Well, yes, that is true, but because of how the stack works, they will never actually get exiled by these cards, and will instead be phased out from the king's triggered ability. This is also why you will not want to run cantrip kind of spells like Bandage that have the draw a card bit added on to them, as these cards with targets will fail to resolve if they have no legal targets when they try to resolve. And that means that none of the rest of the card will resolve, so no card draw. Okay, so why is all of this happening this way? Why don't the tokens get exiled? Why don't they die when they phase out? And why don't cantrips like Bandage work to draw a card? So let's take a look at what it means for something to phase out. Phasing can be found in the comprehensive rules in section 702.26, and there are a whole lot of rules baggage for phase, but basically when something is phased out, the game treats it as though it does not exist. Also, when you phase something out, you phase out all the things attached to it, like auras, equipment, and even counters. So now that begs the question, what does it mean for something to be treated as if it doesn't exist? It does, it's still there, but how do we act like it isn't? It cannot affect or be affected by anything in the game. Board wipes, damage effects, static effects, etc. will not have any impact on the permanent that is phased out. But the object that is phased out is still in that zone. So if the king's ability phases out a 1/1 spirit token, that token doesn't cease to exist like a typical token would when it goes to do a zone change, like being bounced to your hand, or exiled, or destroyed, or even shuffled into your library. It's actually still there on the battlefield, but we just treat it like it isn't. But it is, but it's like it isn't. Okay, magic and stuff. So that's what it means for something to be phased out, but when do things phase back in? The King's second triggered ability says that you make a spirit token whenever he or another spirit you control phases in. So when do we actually treat things like they exist again? When do they phase in again? The game doesn't actually have a phase step, it's just part of the untap step. In fact, it is the very first part, as we can see in Comprehensive Rules 502.1. That first, all phased-in permanents with phasing that the active player controls phase out, and all phased-out permanents that the active player controlled when they phased out phase in. This all happens simultaneously. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. So if you want to really be mean to a player that has things phased out, you can force them to skip their untap step through cards like Stasis and Yozi the Morning Star. Yes, if they skip their untap step, then their phased out stuff doesn't come back. So Stasis, which is always mean, is especially mean to a Teferi's Protection player. But now we get to the part of the episode where I talk about how this king has a pretty big flaw to him, making him much less powerful than you might want it to be. This weakness is something that a lot of players are not going to know about, and they'll probably play the commander wrong in their games. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it has no impact on the game and how it plays out, even if they do make these errors, but maybe it does. I had covered the win part of phasing, and when we continue to look at the CR, we will find section 502.4 that says, no player receives priority during the untap step, so no spells can be cast or resolved, and no abilities can be activated or resolved. Any ability that triggers during this step will be held until the next time a player would receive priority, which is usually during the upkeep step. So why is this bad news for the king? To answer that, we will need to take another close look at his second triggered ability. Whenever King of the Oathbreakers or another spirit you control phases in, create a tapped 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. Okay, so did you catch it? His ability creates tapped spirit tokens. And why is that bad? His ability triggers when things phase in. And abilities like that go onto the stack when a player would receive priority, which means not until the upkeep step, which is after the untap. So on your turn, you'll be making a bunch of tapped creatures that will stay tapped until your next turn. I imagine that a lot of players will be making these tokens in their games before the untap part happens, and then untapping their newly created spirits. It's not a massive game changer, but it could if they planned to use those tokens in many ways that could be used, if they actually build their deck around tapping all of these tokens. Some players might even think that these new tokens don't have Summoning Sickness, as a lot of players believe that Summoning Sickness is something that is removed from creatures during the upkeep, or maybe that it is even removed when you untap with them at the beginning of your turn. But that is not the case here. Other cases in which this will lead to mistakes is if a deck is built to take advantage of things with Convoke, or maybe just cards like Diversionary Tactics that have a cost requiring you to tap down creatures in order to activate. These are things that people might be accidentally doing faster or earlier than they should be doing because they're tapping creatures that shouldn't actually yet be untapped. So if you plan to make a deck around this King of the Oathbreakers, then keep this in mind, or if you know someone in your friend group, your play group, that's planning to make a deck built around him, please send them this video to help them avoid making these errors. If you encounter people at your LGS making these errors, then you can kindly let them know about their error. I think that the King is actually a really cool commander, and it has a very powerful way to protect himself, as he does make a massive amount of creatures, and you can protect all of them, not just himself. Really actually a cool, powerful commander. Okay, and now for the bonus question, or well, questions. It's sort of two questions in one. You control a 3/3 creature, and while in combat, you block a 2/2 creature with it. Then later, a player tries to shock it for 2 damage to kill it, but in response, you cast Giant Growth to give it +3/+3 until end of turn, so that it survives the now 4 damage on its 3 toughness by making it have 6 toughness. Then a player attempts to overload a Cyclonic Rift, and you really want to keep your creature, so you cast Reality Ripple to phase it out so that when the Rift resolves, it will not see it and bounce it back to your hand. Now, what happens to the phased out object that is your 6/6 creature with 4 damage marked on it when you go to the end step? Will you untap on your next turn with a 6/6 that still has 4 damage marked on it? It was phased out during the cleanup, so if it's treated as if it doesn't exist, does it have the damage cleaned from it? And any end of turn continuous effects applied to it, do they get cleaned off of it if it was phased out during the cleanup? Let me know what you think. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that a few of you have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta! And for anybody that's still sticking around, are you guys playing Diablo 4? I'm addicted to it. I almost didn't end up making this video because I've been so addicted to it lately, but yeah. Okay, Diablo. All right, now I gotta edit this video so I can get back to my Diablo addiction. All right, yeah, ta-ta.